Number one, model and outline this debate, and then two constructive arguments. First things first, the model and framing. We think this debate operates under a global context. And by teaching children to feel shame about wealth, what we're saying that we're going to use parents to teach children that wealth in and of itself is immoral, but also teach them the horrendous actions committed by wealthy people within history and the current context, how they accumulated this wealth. Things such as slavery, which causes generational wealth. Things such as colonialism, which allows certain more developed countries to become richer than others. I think this is the system in which we're going to educate these children. We're going to educate children about the history of wealth and how they're accumulated. But note, under our city house, we have nothing against people having a high salary. Well, the problem we have is people not redistributing that high salary once they get it, because they have the capacity to help starving people around the world. For that reason, we're very proud of it. With that said, first constructive argument, we're going to outline to you all the reasons in which wealth in and of itself is immoral, and that is the truth. And when parents have the utmost responsibility to educate their children about the truth, which is that wealth is immoral. Why is this? There are 4 reasons why. First of all, I think it is inherently important to understand that wealth has been accumulated on an unjust level. That is, that rich people stay wealthy and accumulate wealth, oftentimes from systems that perpetuate inequality, such as private schools, things such as like having just better education than the poor, inherently making the system rigged against those who already have less. But second of all, even if you say people necessarily have hard work for their wealth, which is a subset, a very small minority who actually work for their wealth, we think that in and of itself is also unjust, particularly because the qualities we possess or the talent we possess also is based on randomness, and thus we have no moral claim to the wealth necessarily than someone else, just because you're born with arbitrary qualities that nobody else were chosen to not be born with. But second of all, wealth causes immense problem within our society, and thus it is also immoral. Wealth literally perpetuates inequality by allowing wealthy people to lobby and make money to lobby government, to allow wealthier people to do things such as create private school systems that are so exclusive that poor people have no chance of competing at an academic level. Fourth of all, even if you say that the processes in which you accumulated wealth is completely justified, why is wealth still bad? The reason for this is that by the virtue of resources being limited on earth, the fact that you have more money and you have more capital to buy things around necessarily means that others have less, and this in and of itself is bad. But fourth of all, lastly, even if you're a completely benevolent person, you accumulate the wealth, the implication is that you're still an unjust person, because you're only able to accumulate this wealth through a lack of redistribution. That means that you, as a wealthy person, have the capacity to help people who are suffering, but you chose not to. We think this is largely analogous to if you're an adult individual walking down the road and you saw a toddler who is going to drown, and you chose not to save that toddler. Rich people have the capacity to help the poor people, but because they didn't redistribute their wealth, they made the active choice to not help, and thus that is shameful and immoral. With that said, are there any POIs before we move on? Okay, so what is the implication of this being immoral? We think that parents just have the utmost responsibility to educate the children about the truth. That is, that parents need to provide children with the truth in order to make decisions in the future. Given that I provide to you so many reasons why wealth is immoral, parents should do so. Second of all, I'm going to talk about how we create societal benefits under opening government. Why is this? First of all, I want you to know that this is likely to create change in society for 2 reasons. One, largely parents are instrumental to the development of a child. That is, parents is the person that you live with, and that's what we see, for example, children agreeing with a lot of the politics that the parents believe in. But second of all, if we allow this education to continue over a long period of time, the implication that we create the culture in which we generally make consensus in society is that wealth is shameful, and thus the culture in itself will drive social change. Given that, we have many implications of this argument. First of all, more redistributive policies proposed by politicians. The reason for this is not just the politicians want to make change, but also people prompting politicians to make change. That is, if I'm a politician and I start allowing for more loopholes in the tax system and not helping the poor, people will not vote for me anymore because they deem me as an immoral person who should be out of office. Second of all, more charitable organizations. But third of all, reconciliation for previous colonies and people who were enslaved by the majority of the populations. Recognize that in the status quo, many times these reconciliation for previous colonies does not exist because people don't necessarily feel that they should be shameful about that history. Under our house, we tell them you should feel shameful because the reason why your country is more developed is from the exploitation and plunder of foreign nations. Next, we think that we have more societal challenge of the 1%. That is that people become more critical about the processes in which the rich gain that wealth, and thus we have more examination of potential corruption and potential crimes committed by those individuals. And understand, shame is a unique tool to create social change, because shame inherently allows self-interest to drive social change, and there's no reason why self-interest people would allow for social change if they did not have shame. For these reasons, proud to propose.
While it's true that money can't necessarily buy happiness directly, money does buy you options. We think with options comes the gratification and safety that every single person in this world not only should have, but deserves to have. Okay, for all those reasons, so proud to stand on opening opposition today. Firstly, I'm going to be addressing the comparative under which we'll be debating on opening opposition, and then I'll be refuting what came out of opening government speech, and then going to my two contentions. Firstly, about how the pursuit of wealth is valuable, legitimate, and should be encouraged, and secondly, about how their side is going to squelch discourse and meaningful action around income inequality. So firstly, our comparative. We think that we would rather have parents, instead of shaming their children about wealth, acknowledge the utility of money in the real world while emphasizing the harms of excessive wealth and using any means necessary. We think this just has to do with teaching the morals, such as don't cheat or hurt other people, and isn't necessarily connected to wealth, but should be if necessary. Okay, now touching on some of their arguments. Their first argument talks about how wealth is gleaned on a basis of systemic injustices. There's two responses to this argument. Firstly, I don't think it's fair for side opposition to have to defend slavery and ask their parents to tell their children that slavery is okay because at least you got money out of it. Because we think it's possible to not teach shame about wealth itself and also not glorify it, right? Like the motion isn't saying that we should teach shame about wealth obtained through sordid means. It's just talking about wealth, period. So like I said before in my comparative, I think it's justified for us to defend that parents can teach children to not feel shame about wealth, but also abide by moral codes, like not cheating and literally killing or enslaving other people. The second argument I have is, the second response I have, even if you don't buy my previous rebuttal, I think that wealth isn't a zero-sum game, which means Jason's idea about how $1 earned is a dollar taken away from somebody else just isn't true, because wealth is always circulating and there's enough for everything to go around. So they need to prove why it's illegitimate for somebody to pursue their self-interest, like getting a new car, getting a new house, or just spending money on things that they need, and why that's a bad thing necessarily. Okay, so now moving on to my arguments. My first argument is that the pursuit of wealth is valuable and ought to be encouraged to an extent. For that, yes.
Our point was more than just about slavery, but the fact that rich people, when they hold on this wealth, they're making the active choice to not help those who are more vulnerable.
Right, okay. In my second argument, I'm going to talk about why, even if you teach shame about wealth, wealthy people are still going to hold on to their wealth, except they're not going to allocate it because they feel so shameful that they won't even address the fact that they're so wealthy and have all of these systemic privileges. But now moving on to my first argument. We think that it's pretty apparent that we live in a capitalist society where your economic mobility is directly tied to what quality of life you necessarily have, right? This is true because with money comes a lot of privileges and freedoms, such as being able to have savings in case of emergencies, going to a prestigious university, going on vacations, or just enjoying debate, right? This means that you necessarily have a higher quality of life because you're not concerned with making it paycheck to paycheck. This means that people who are wealthier inherently get to savor life more. So why does this fit into the context of debate? We think that teaching children to feel shame about wealth actively disincentivizes them to want to make money in the future and go into higher paying jobs, for example, because they associate it with such a negative and shameful connotation. This is bad, because given what we know about how society operates, which is on a basis of currency, it necessarily prevents that child from understanding and acting upon a realistic perception of the world. Meaning that when kids grow up, they're going to feel embarrassed and actively discouraged from acquiring personal wealth at the point at which they will not feel motivated to do things like ask for raises from their bosses, go into fields that are high paying, or invest in stocks such that they're going to get high returns, right? The impact of this is that this is harmful exactly because these children are going to be placed at a severe disadvantage because they can't enjoy life at its maximum extent or relish the security and happiness that comes with wealth that I talked about earlier. I think every single person has the right to be selfish to a certain extent and pursue things that genuinely bring them joy, and a lot of times that comes with money. Second argument, I'm going to talk about how this is squelching discourse and action around income inequality. Shame equals silence. We think that there's no discourse about a lot of subjects in society because it's considered taboo and because people feel shame about it because they were taught to associate that subject with shame from a young age. For example, mental health, sexual assault, these are all topics that are traditionally associated with shame and are huge problems in society, but are never talked about because it's never brought up in a room, because it makes you feel uncomfortable that you were the first person to bring up such a shameful and forbidden topic, right? We think this is going to happen for wealth, and it's not just about talking about your own money, but it's also about others, right? While we recognize that excessive wealth is a bad thing, shutting down any conversation about it isn't going to lead to any meaningful action. And we think transparency is key because it leads to people exploring the implications of having wealth and get to use it for better. So on their side, you necessarily get less billionaires like Tom Steyer, who's running for Democratic president, talking about income inequality and acknowledging that while he has wealth, he can use it for good, because that topic is never going to get brought up in the first place. So the policies they get never never actualized or realized because people don't like to acknowledge the fact that they're wealthy or others are wealthy. So proud to oppose.
So what does shame actually look like? I think there are three things to note here. First is that these parents will be teaching their children that it's wrong to hold on to wealth and to hoard it. They're not necessarily telling their children not to work hard to actually become successful, but rather they're teaching them that it's wrong to hold on to wealth when you can use that extra $2 million to benefit the lives of so many other people. That's what we're talking about. Number two, we're also talking about the strongest moral incentive here. Because when parents tell these children that it's shameful and it's wrong, you're actually constructing the very moral compass of these children. So that's the strongest incentive possible to get these children to do these things. Number three, we actually think that this shameful act is actually super compelling because it's in your gut, and actually it's your own internal conflict that motivates you to do these things. With that said, two things in this speech. Number one are two themes that today's rebuttal and construction came down to. The first on if it's justified, and secondly, on whether or not this actually is beneficial for the entirety of society. Secondly, I'm going to be going into the last point on how you actually have more personal happiness when parents teach this moral code to their children. So number one, the first theme of today's debate came down to is if it's justified or not. Note, this theme is extremely important because it's a beliefs that motion. So that means that these parents inherently, whether or not it's a good idea to teach these children about it. So insofar as Jason is able to prove to you that the acquisition of this wealth and the holding on to it is actually inherently immoral, these parents are justified in teaching their children that this is an immoral act, just like any other immoral act, such as lying. We think that that in itself is able to win us today's debate. But what did they say in response to Jason's point? Two things. Number one, they said they don't have to defend slavery. I think they necessarily do, because oftentimes Nike accumulated wealth through sweatshops and child labor. I think that's a fact that they have to accept and something that they have to defend. With that said, I'm going to move to the second theme on which side is more beneficial for society. Why is this theme so important? I think this theme is incredibly important because these parents want to benefit their children. So insofar as society is better off and we're able to prove that we're better at doing that, we win today's debate. With that said, what did they tell you? They told you two things. Number one, that you actually disincentivize children from acquiring this wealth. I think this point is just largely a misunderstanding of what we're trying to do. And I think my clarification of what these parents are actually telling their children actually deals with that. But furthermore, let's just say that these parents, for some whatever reason, tell these children not to work hard. I think that these children will probably just, that's a minority of cases. So we're willing to swallow that harm, but the majority of people actually still actively pursue that. So on net, we can outweigh that harm. Number two, they talked about how shame leads to less discourse in politics. I just want to note that in the status quo, politicians are extremely absorbed by lobbyists and special interest groups. There's no discourse of wealth inequality in Parliament. There's no legislation that changes that. So I don't think we could possibly go worse than the status quo. At the point in which Jason comes up here and gives you the exact point on how in future legislation, when these politicians inherently feel accumulating wealth is bad, that's how you lead to more discourse in the future. That's how you lead to legislative change. I think we actually win under that point. With that said, what did Jason tell you in his point? Number one, he told you that there's more charitable acts because parents have to follow through. If these parents are telling their children that it's inherently amoral to hold on to wealth, they themselves have to give wealth out. So that means there's more charitable acts going out. Number two, these children in the future are also likely to become more charitable because inherently they believe it's wrong to hold on to this wealth. Number three, Jason told you how in the long term there's more legislative change. Sure.
The motion doesn't say children feel shame about hoarding wealth, but more so that it's morally abhorrent to acquire that wealth in the first place. Why should we have to defend people never letting go of a single penny in their entire lifetime?
The That's not what the motion says. It says children should feel inherently shameful about wealth. So that means wealth is actually the accumulation of monetary resources over time. So that means you're holding on to it, not that you're getting it. We're not talking about people should be successful, that they should feel shameful about being successful, but rather the accumulation of that. So with that said, I'm going to move into my last point on personal happiness. I want to note that a person like Bill Gates is inherently happy in giving away almost all of his wealth because he believes that that's the morally right thing to do. So under our side of the house, when we teach these children this moral compass and this moral code, and when they grow up, inherently they'll be happy because they believe they're doing something right and just in society and that they're helping so many people. So I think the personal person under our side of the house is also happier in doing these types of acts. But number two, we think we also lead to more legislation. We think that the other way that you're trying to coerce people to actually incentivize people to change these things is through legislation. So at the end of the day, because under our side of the house, we only try to tell you why wealth is bad and why parents should do this. We're very proud to propose.
I want everybody in this room to implore upon themselves of things that were traditionally sought to be shameful. Mental health, sexual assault. These things were not discussed about in common discourse because they were said to be shameful. Now, if you are trying to overthrow a system of systemic oppression through the unjust accumulation of resources, this is something that you need to discuss with other people about. Upon this basis, I'm so proud to oppose today. As the second speaker on side, opening government, opening up, we'll be doing a few things. Firstly, going into some direct refutation on the points that they brought to us, going into some reconstruction on my partner's points, and then going into a third constructive point of our own. Thank you. Firstly, going into some refutation. So they brought to us the point on how colonialism and other things have dictated that the accumulation of wealth is essentially illegal. But the thing is, here's the problem with the premise that they brought to us. You can educate without shaming somebody for something that they didn't have control over either. So without instilling a sense of guilt within them, you are able to make them be more productive and use their wealth for more productive means. You don't have to, in order to initiate change, you don't have to make people feel shameful. And in fact, when you make people feel shameful, it actually is counterproductive to your cause. Next, they brought to us on how it is based off arbitrary necessary. Now, moving on to the reconstruction on my partner. So my partner brought you the fact that we need to acknowledge the utility of wealth because, especially in the systems that we have currently, it rewards people that are able to strive towards an increased quantity of wealth within their personal safety. And the thing that they brought to us is that there's systemic injustices and there's the way that they derive this wealth is through colonialism. So it was a direct clash with our point. However, we brought to you time and time again that education is something that moves people outwards to create action and impact on the real world, whereas shame and guilt push people inwards to internalize the psychological harm that they feel that they should be bearing the burden of. Okay. Secondly, they brought to us the point on my partner brought to you the point on how it squelches action for income redistribution and all the policies that they are actively striving for on their side. But what we have brought to you time and time again is that you don't get any of this, you don't get any policies if you don't have discourse. They said that, well, actually, I'll take you in a moment. Politicians are super absorbed by wealth right now, and they're being lobbied left and right so that they can't have wealth. Well, we bring to you the fact that side opening government obviously didn't watch the Democratic debate because within, you can see there's so many different politicians like Elizabeth Warren, like Bernie Sanders, talking about the redistribution of wealth because this is something that is deemed to be something that they should be actively striving towards to change, but they don't.
Hello, only attacked one part of our principal argument. Can you please address the system of inequality that exists in all societies that perpetuates wealth, and the fact that wealthy people, when they hold on to this wealth, is making an active choice and allowing people to suffer?
Yes, okay. All of the problems with the accumulation and the hoarding of wealth, it can be addressed with education and parents teaching their children to do something productive with the monetary value that they have been poured into. This isn't something that people should be ashamed of because when the moment that people are ashamed, they won't talk about it, they won't be outwardly expressive to other people if you want real policies and real change to occur. Now we want to talk about the psychological harms to the individual because when you tell somebody that that didn't choose to be born into any semblance of wealth, that what they have is terrible, the things that they own make them a morally aberrant person, that's extremely detrimental to the individual because they didn't choose to be born into the situation that they have either. So rather than shaming them about their condition that they didn't have control over, we can necessarily change it so that they acknowledge the utility of the monetary value that their parents or their ancestors have accumulated, so that they can actually use it for they can use it to alleviate the disparity between different socioeconomic classes. This is something exclusively that you get on our side. And it's only when you do this that you can reverse the idea that the amount of capital that you have is indicative of the quality of person that you are. And it's really hard to utilize and improve on a system when you don't fully understand it, and you won't be able to understand it if you are shameful and you are guilty of the wealth that you have. It's for all these reasons and more. I'm so proud of that person.
Going to firstly give you a 2-point extension on how this changes the narrative of success and how also this, remember my tagline, also helps people's self-worth as well. So firstly, in terms of changing the nature of success, recognize that in the status quo, the pride is synonymous with wealth because of the fact that wealth is synonymous with success. So people are prideful of their wealth. People think that wealth is success. We think that this changes the narrative of success at the extent where now you are saying that being and accumulating wealth is no longer having success, and shifts those ideals for other things. We see this as something like, instead of discovering something for monetary compensation or innovating for wealth, you are now doing things like discovering things for the pursuit of knowledge or innovating for the sake of progression. Recognize the difference here in the sense that people are now doing things for the right reasons and also have a lesser incentive for corruption, because now you have no incentive to go and commit crimes such based on monetary compensation or commit crimes that marginalize people within society, because that is something that is now systematically not as important as other values. This evens the playing field for a lot of people because of the fact that now you are getting rid of a lot of that corruption that is systematic within society. And we think that at this extent, you are now going to have a lesser amount of crime based off that. Recognize that this is different from opening government, as they talk about slavery being a means of acquiring wealth illegitimately, whereas we're telling you that this is actually going to decrease the amount of corruption you have in the long term and the mechanisms as to why that occurs. But now let's talk about our second point on how this talks about self-worth, right? Because we think that you're going to be actually increasing the amount of self-worth with people in the lower socioeconomic class, because currently what you see is people who are disadvantaged and stuck in this structural cycle of poverty and seem to be unsuccessful within societal standards because we equate success with the accumulation of wealth. We see that in either world, there's always going to be inequities in wealth, and as a result, there are these structural problems that don't allow for an even playing field because of this inequity in terms of success. However, when you now make people ashamed of accumulating or having this wealth and then prioritize these other values that we talk about, we think that this means that everybody is at least on the same playing field in terms of what it means to be able to accumulate this level of success, as well as a greater access to a fair shot at being successful. What does this really mean? This firstly means that because you're shifting the narrative of success, both for people who are disadvantaged in developing countries, but also in the first world, it shifts the value to people to be how cohesive families are, rather than how much money you have. And if you extend that narrative also to families who are wealthy, they're also going to have different values that then lead them to their own individual happiness. So there are a few impacts to this. Firstly, we think there's a higher self-worth on net for just people who are in lower socioeconomic classes and structurally disadvantaged in terms of being able to accumulate that wealth. But secondly, in terms of, it shifts the perspective of what it means to be successful for those who are wealthy, which then means that because of this reason, it also makes those people look to more different values that are more likely to be happy, because even though there's a lot of people who are wealthy within society, we see that a lot of those people aren't necessarily happy and don't have a sense of self-fulfillment because, for example, a lot of that wealth was passed down, or they just don't, even though they've strived for this idea of success, they still don't feel happy. We think instead you should be looking towards those morals and those values that are actually going to give success. I really highly encourage you. There you go.
Wouldn't you agree that it's necessarily detrimental to have people just being okay and being complacent with being poor? Having people strive for greatness is necessarily what propels the economy and allows these people to actually eradicate the cycle of poverty.
I think it's kind of offensive when you ask me if it's okay to be poor and whether people should be complacency to not having a lot of money. I think just because you don't have a lot of money does not make you a bad person, and also means that, like, I think they're still going to have their own thing. Like, we don't necessarily think that, I think that's kind of ridiculous, and also, like, I think that the point is more that if you have that accumulation of wealth, it's not something that is the primary factor for success. We are trying to tell you that you shouldn't be looking to wealth as a factor of success, but instead look to other things like being a good person, having good connections with your family, having those like ideals with the rest of society and greater society. Okay, quickly, what did we hear from opening opposition? We heard shame is silence. Okay, so in the op world, wealth is seen as something to strive for. Recognize that this pride is really harmful because as a result, there is no discourse since the status quo is like success is good, that is pride, there's no discourse here. But secondly, in terms of this utility of wealth, we think that opposition buys into the corrupt system by educating children not to value wealth, which changes society to decrease emphasis on commodification. But finally, they talk about these psychological harms to rich children, and we think we want to avoid this harm, so we are striving, because they strive to be filthy rich, whereas we're telling you to value morals. On this basis, very proud to stand as your example.
Thus far, this debate has largely lacked analysis on the children who are the very fundamental basis of this motion. In my extension, I will provide clear actor analysis on the family dynamic in this scenario, the social interaction, the societal progress that you actually get from this motion, as well as the effect on minorities and how children interact with other children from different socioeconomic statuses and different socio-political power dynamics. Now, in this extension, I'll be doing first a couple of things. Firstly, analyzing the parental relationship. Secondly, analyzing why children are going to necessarily be less charitable. And then thirdly, analyzing children of minorities. As your first speaker on closing opposition, I'll first be going over my extension and then refutation, however much of that will be integrated. Now, let's analyze the first subpoint of my extension on the parental relationship. In the status quo, we see that parents are frequently the ones actually bringing wealth into the home and into their children's lives. Parents are the ones saving for their children's university, saving for health care, and actually the ones putting aside money for emergencies. This means that when they're actively teaching their children that wealth is bad and that they necessarily need to be ashamed of having wealth and accumulating wealth, this means that by not donating all of their money to children, or to charity, which children inherently think is just how society works. They don't really understand how payments work, how being in debt works. They don't really understand any of this. In the logical mind of a child, when a parent is not actually donating all or half of their money to charity, they necessarily demonize that parent in their mind. Now, what does this do for the child? When the parent is preaching about how wealth is terrible, how wealth means you're malevolent, how wealth means that you could never actually be a good person in society, yet that same parent is the one that is saving money and actually investing money in the stock market, that child is never going to actually understand or build trust with their parent, because they're going to see that their parent is being very, very hypocritical and not understand that. They're going to lose respect and they're going to less likely buy into other rhetoric that their parents are trying to instill in them, which means that they're going to have a more divisive relationship with their parents, and the children will not actually agree with their parents. Further though, we see that poorer children will actually hate wealthier children, no thank you, because they're going to assume that the child is malevolent because wealth equals shame. And so that by that child having shame in their wealth, by that child actually having wealth really at all, that child must be a very, very bad person, so that child is never going to actually try and interact with them. Secondly though, on the idea of charity. When children feel ashamed of their wealth, when children feel ashamed of their parents' wealth, donating to charity, as it is a symbol of wealth, will be less likely to happen on their side of the house. Because in a child's brain, the logical conclusion is to donate to charity, right? That is very good. But when you shame them and indoctrinate them from a young age that donating to charity means that you inherently are wealthy, and that being wealthy is very, very bad, that child is never actually going to have charitable values, and that child is never actually going to donate because they don't want to be humiliated by the very people that are supposed to be supporting them. This means that this will carry into their adult life, and they likely will not try and donate to charity in their adult life because they don't want to be ashamed of their power. Recognize, and this has been largely mischaracterized, that in the status quo, when rich people and wealthy people actually donate to charity, that is largely publicized. That is often done to actually clear up their reputation and is done for personal reasons. This is very largely public, so people will know when you're donating to charity. Thirdly, though, this idea of minorities. because of how the government fundamentally structures healthcare, education, voting. This means that minorities systemically are oppressed and have less access to these fundamental social resources. By being oppressed and disenfranchised, they're thus less likely to actually be able to obtain wealth, and they're too ashamed to actually talk about the fact that they don't have wealth and they don't have fundamental resources, which means that they're never actually going to seek out help, and they're never going to break out of the cycle of poverty. Further though, when minorities continually exist in lower socioeconomic statuses, and wealthier people can actually access these social resources with ease, you're never going to have that discussion between those two classes, and you're never actually going to rectify the problem, because nobody wants to lose rich people, I'll take you in a second, into this echo chamber of wealth and power. Yes?
Even if there's less donations, which I don't really think is clearly linked on the extension, on OG still talks about legislative changes that actually break down the systematic barriers that prevent minorities from accessing the basic necessities.
Thank you. We see that legislative changes don't always actually lead to societal changes, because ultimately what that does is makes the rich very, very angry, and the government is often the one trying to cater to the rich, because the rich are the ones that support their political campaigns, so the government is less likely to actually enact legislative change and will not actually achieve any benefits for minorities on their side of the house. Further though, at a drawback, the rich person is always going to seem smarter and better qualified for the position, because you never actually talk about why they're more qualified, why they had better access to education as a child, why they have more resources, and why they're systemically more likely to actually succeed in life. It's because we actually get benefits for minorities because we actually tangibly help children that we take this debate.
The fatal assumption on the opposition bench is that there is a corrupt system and we cannot change it. Except proposition, specifically closing government, tells you exactly how you can change that corrupt system, change our metrics of success, and create a better world. 3 questions in this debate. 1, is striving for wealth morally permissible? 2, how do children perceive this wealth? And 3, how does this education change the metrics for success in society? Let's start on that first question of moral permissibility. On opening opposition and on closing opposition, we hear, yes, wealth is good, we ought to celebrate it because people can be selfish, spend on things they like. But this doesn't really engage with the idea of morality, because we tell you that wealth is actually immoral in 3 ways. 1, the fact that this selfishness they concede to hurts others insofar as the use of wealth is exploited. Your vacation to the Bahamas increased carbon emissions, flooding the coast, destroying the lives of those people. Your fancy watch and jewelry has Mika scrounged from the earth by a child laborer. We don't think those are things that are moral. We don't think those are things that are permissible in their world. But second, the problem is that wealth becomes the overarching metric for success. This becomes immoral at the extent where people prioritize getting to the top of the corporate ladder, committing crimes of corruption and wealth, instead of being decent human beings. We think that is also immoral. But the final reason that we're winning on this morality claim is because these narratives are immoral when they take and devastate the self-worth of the poor. OO says to strive for a vacation and comfort, yet it is the child stuck in poverty who obviously never gets that, who is told in their world that they obviously must not be a success. And that brings us to the second theme. How do kids perceive this wealth? We hear 3 things from the CO extension. 1 is that the parental relationship is harmed insofar as these parents are still saving and using money, and children don't understand finance, so they see the parent as hypocritical. 2 responses. 1, presumably, given that parent is educating their child about how wealth is shameful, they have also shifted their thinking and their metric for success when it comes to wealth. That link to why that was not true was pretty unclear on closing opposition. But second, even if their analysis on how kids aren't exactly financially adept suggests that they're unaware of 401k plans, they're unaware of RRSPs, and their parents' investment into the stock market, which means it's probably unlikely they're going to be like, Mom, stop using that 401k, because they simply don't know, according to CO. Sure.
Why can't we teach shame about cheating, overindulgence, and greed, and not wealth?
The link that you miss is that when you don't teach shame about wealth, the comparative is that you automatically say wealth is a good thing, and you buy into this narrative when they say, oh, you ought to be successful when you have wealth. To that extent, that means that kids are always looking for the way they can be more wealthy in the opposition world. Kids are always looking for the way they can make the most money, because that has become the metric for success according to this society. The second thing we hear from CO is that these children will lack charitable values. We think that they're actually more likely to donate because they don't want to be perceived as hoarding all the wealth, given we tell them that being wealthy and being super filthy rich is bad, which means that they want to distribute that money. But two, we think that it's actually better that they think success and being a good person actually looks like things like donating your time, like going to a volunteer shelter and like handing out soup for the homeless. We think that these are a far better way for people to actually be altruistic, and that you're more likely to get that on the proposition world when you say being successful is not being rich, but rather being a good person, being innovative, striving for knowledge, all those other metrics that success that are eclipsed by wealth in their world. The last thing we hear, however, and this was largely derivative of OO, is that there's going to be less discussion. I think my partner dealt with this when she tells you that the comparative is celebrating wealth and telling those in poverty that they aren't successful. And that brings us to the final point. How does education change the metric for success in society? OG brought you a case about why wealth is bad, but it was only my partner who illustrated for you what really changes in society when we change that narrative that says wealth is good and you should strive for it, and we instead say wealth should not be your ideal, you should be looking towards these other metrics, things like knowledge, things like innovation, things like just being a decent human being. We told you two things in this extension. One, that you're going to change the narrative of success, and that decreases your incentive to commit wealth-based crimes. But two, and more importantly, that it helps the self-worth of those who just do not have money because they are stuck in this corrupt system. The premise of this is that wealth inequities destroy the self-worth of the poor, and that we can shift the values of what being successful looks like from being at the top of the corporate ladder to just simply being a good person to finding happiness and fulfillment in your life. We really did hear a response to this from the CO, and the reason why this is devastating is because we tell you that there is a way to change a system based on wealth. There is a way to change the idea that wealth is glorified, and that is to say to your child, wealth is shameful, you should not be advocating or striving for it. So at the end of the day, if we want to change that system, if we want the poor to not be stuck in cycles of poverty, and we want people to actually be happy, we say reject the money.
Let's make a clear distinction here. Shaming a child about wealth they didn't acquire is intrinsically and drastically different from preventing wealth itself. Wealth, regardless of this motion, is never going to disappear. So it doesn't matter whether or not wealth is actually moral. Note, this motion doesn't specify that parents feel shame about their wealth themselves. In fact, we think if they're actively amassing wealth, they probably kind of like it. The global poor do live under a system of dictatorship. But this shameful divide perpetuated in youth only strengthens it. Our first theme on the nature of shame. We think shame, as defined by our opening, is to actively avoid, to actively hide it, and to actively dislike it. But secondly, as Warren so crucially highlights, the disconnect between a child seeing their working class, middle class, upper class parent devoting their careers 100 hours a week and stretching themselves thin in order to amass wealth is incredibly disorienting. As children, you directly connect putting in a lot of work to amass amounts of wealth, because it's kind of hard to explain and to teach your 10-year-old about structural economic violence that a bunch of you guys are paying thousands of dollars to major in every year. So first, it hurts children's livelihoods in the sense that they connect working hard with acquiring wealth. We think if that children aren't meant to work hard in the future, that means they're not able to access better qualities of life in which they should be pursuing themselves. But secondly, it makes them ashamed of their identity if they happen to be wealthy. We think this is very intrinsically damaging if a parent is telling you to be ashamed of your family and to be ashamed of how your family is operated, especially in your forward years. But thirdly, it also makes you hate wealthy people, specifically wealthy children, because that's who you're interacting with in 30 years. And because it's hard to rationalize when you're younger. Like, imagine Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates' children getting their $1 billion empire, and then remembering how alienated and bullied they were in their from their community as a child. They never actually start these humanitarian causes because they feel this intrinsic separation from their community at the very basis. But furthermore, we heard this idea about self-worth from closing government. We don't support the shaming of the working class. We think ideally, society would understand that a lack of wealth is often due to the situation that they grew up in, and the disenfranchised, neglected communities that receive less government attention. We don't, however, think that a lack of wealth should be a virtue, because the idea of hard work that will lead to wealth, and wealth is good because it makes you comfortable, is an idea that, regardless of truth, benefits these individuals' quality of life, and therefore creates a better economy. Sure.
wealthy children being harmed on our state house is a truly low impact point, considering that the entire OG case is premised on eliminating wealth in the first place because of shame. So it's like, presumably wealthy children.
Okay. We don't actually really care if wealthy children get their feelings hurt. We care about the fact that when wealthy children get their feelings hurt, they will grow up and still have these mass billion-dollar empires, and therefore be like, well, you hurt my feelings, I don't need to give you my money, even though I should be, because I should be proud of my deed and giving back to it. So second thing, on the nature of wealth, we don't actually think that it's like a net good or bad of wealth is in contention with stability, rather the implications of what different ways wealth can be instrumentalized, because money does go make the world go round. The entire government bench has one blatantly false characterization, that these children are automatically going to listen to their parents and believe them, and that these parents buy the teachings they pass on to their children. It is at this point the legislative change that OG talks about is infeasible and irrelevant. Because seeing as we've established that wealth is inevitable, what is the comparative between status quo and the products of the children of this motion? Firstly, the active philanthropy of charity has historically been a very publicized event. We got ribbons, we got big checks, awards, you name it. Publicity is a huge incentive for billionaires and businesses to like publicize their company and to gain traction. So what happens when wealth becomes irrelevant and a taboo subject? We think that they would live secret, lavish lives because donation is an admission of your wealth. Well, because unless you deplete your wealth entirely, you always expect to give more. And then there's no reason for people, whether or not their parents say it so, to be wholeheartedly selfless, and give everything they have to their community to other people. So secondly, what is the real comparative? We think that wealth, it's either the wealthy donate a small portion of their wealth, which still creates substantial change because it's still billions of dollars, or secondly, the wealthy hide their wealth and therefore don't want to like lose any of their money in case they lose it all. This leads to our third impact. Those who are born in poor communities with access to less schools no longer are able to draw that crucial dichotomy between people born in areas with better healthcare and better education and better resources, therefore are giving them a better future. Let's weigh this really quickly. Let's pretend we didn't spend this entire thing refuting this idea. Let's say that these wealthy people will suddenly be moral and children will actually listen to their parents and like buy into that idea. So what actually motivates children in the future? Because just because you don't like wealth and you think it's evil and immoral doesn't mean you automatically want to save the world. Because if it was purely based on human morals and the absence of wealth, every single working class person, every single poor person that recognized they couldn't actually access wealth because of the way they were situated and like the place in which they were born, therefore being trying to save the world. And it's not what's happening in the status quo. Because people are still striving towards wealth because they see it as a sign of better quality of life. We don't think that's inherent in that. We're proud to oppose.